Lara Croft has had a bit of a wild ride since the inception of the Survivor timeline. She's fallen, and risen, and fallen again onto spikes, into rivers, and sometimes into rivers and onto spikes. It's an eventful take on the iconic heroine of action games past, although to my mind, a bit of a mixed bag. Or satchel, or whatever it is raiders used to carry treasure in. However, I'm going to assert that Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the latest and final game in the series, is perhaps the most effective game in the modern trilogy. Thanks to a number of improvements and a more imaginative array of death animations, it's the truest execution of what they were aiming to achieve with the timeline to date. One of the strengths of this new rebooted series has been the open, gear-gated hub areas I absolutely won't call Metroidvania-likes, in which you can set the pace of play yourself. Shadow of the Tomb Raider opts for the Yamatai approach of Tomb Raider 2013 by giving us large, open areas to explore across this sprawl of a map, which are all cleverly interwoven. However, the Peruvian Jungle location dials the Yamatai principle up to a thrilling extreme. When faced with a collage of leaves and more leaves, talk about not seeing the wood for the trees, being able to tell a crypt entrance or even a cliff edge from snarled roots or a clump of foliage is practically impossible unless you stop being lazy and go see for yourself. Now, where Yamatai flowed seamlessly from one place to the next visually, framing the vast scenescape either with the camera or objects and landmarks guiding you to the way forward, the bulk of the setting in Shadow is so dense that there really is no way forward you can discern from the background noise. There is a path somewhere in there, of course, but because you have to make a concerted effort to really look for it, the game rather cleverly tricks you into feeling as though you chart your own way. Just like the previous games, there is freedom in its ultimately limited scope, but this new visual complexity gives the illusion of discovery. What I love about the Peruvian Jungle, though it technically counts for a handful of central levels in the game, is that it often borders others, walling them in within a larger jungle. So wherever you are, you always return to the wild. It makes the world of Shadow feel exciting, that it's filled with surprises and danger potentially mere steps away, and by danger I of course mean threats like Jaguar A and Jaguar B here. Now when you aren't dodging this power couple or circling the same tree trying to find your way in the jungle, cursing your rusty orienteering skills, the game presents a selection of locations that are in some cases hiding more secrets than the wilderness. Take the hidden city of Paititi as an example. This ancient city is explorable from the riverbed at the base to the peak of the temple in the mountain. It stuns with its eye-watering verticality, breadth, and depth of interactive possibility. Paititi is bulging at the seams with people to talk to, secret pathways, hidden artifacts, markets, farmland, monoliths, hidden treasures, and quest givers. I spent hours here and on the many activities it had to offer, and there are more populated areas like this in the game, like Kawakyaku. You can't get too comfortable though. During side quests in these areas, you often have to leave the relative safety of the community and dive back into the jungle where brand new pathways, clearings, enemies, and of course death traps will reveal themselves to you. This is what Shadow gets so right when compared to the previous two games. Where Tomb Raider 2013 and Rise both touched upon the idea of secrets to discover and locations to be visited, Shadow embodies this from the ground up through its exceptional visual design, level structure, and slowly revealing map that frankly acts as a mere guideline. But what use are sprawling levels of adventure without rewarding secrets to uncover? And by secrets, of course, I mean tombs and treasure, something previous games seem to subtly resist.
I hate tombs.
Or maybe not so subtly. Now, there were 7 tombs to explore in Tomb Raider 2013, and 9 in Rise of the Tomb Raider. Rather interestingly, they haven't increased the number of challenge tombs since the last. There are still only 9 to explore across many of the game's locations. On paper, this is a bit of a disappointment, and yet, it doesn't feel disappointing. For one, as I mentioned before, levels are much harder to plot, and so challenge tombs feel like more of a secret. Unlike Rise, they aren't all hidden by an easily spotted blockage, or perched high up, but in plain view. A lot of the challenge tombs in Shadow are tucked away off the beaten path or obscured by thick trees. Positioned in such a way, they feel like accidental discoveries. Even when you do stumble across the telltale yellow paint I assume has been left by a mole from Naughty Dog, Making your way to the tomb entrance from there can also be quite the trek. The slight change in presentation frames discovery in a completely different way. Tombs also feel entirely different tonally here. Where they could be described in previous games as giant environmental puzzles tied into the flavour of a specific setting, the tombs seen in Shadow are lethal, ancient, and very much a part of the mythology of the story. The various trials, for example, like this one, function like gargantuan puzzle boxes barely holding together, and range from rickety structures you only have to look at to get tetanus, to burning roller coasters of death and misery. You'd have to be mad to attempt anything this dangerous, and therein lies the real challenge. It isn't just about wit or climbing ability, it's about daring and bravery this time around. Challenges such as these conjure up stories of adventurers excavating tombs in Egypt, where one wrong turn in near darkness could mean a fall to your death. Only in Shadow of the Tomb Raider you actually stumble across the weathered old journals and skeletons of the failed adventurers who came before you, just in case the threat wasn't made clear enough already. Now, there are smaller crypts, or tombs light, scattered about the landscape as well. Where Rise had 5 of these smaller challenges to uncover, Shadow has 5 more, making for 10 in total, to climb and probe for new craftable clothing items on top of the skills rewarded to you in challenge tombs, another welcome change from the weapon parts of previous games that rebrand survival as a better arsenal of weapons instead of improving knowledge or skill. Now, crypts may not be as complex or terrifying, but they only add more meat to an adventurer's bones. Lastly, many of the tombs are laced into the main story progression, with some linked to side quests. The trials are a good example, which you couldn't miss even if you wanted to, and in the case of the Eagle trial on hard, I know I would have avoided it at several points if I could. Now, obviously unavoidable tombs aren't unusual when compared to the previous Survivor titles. The very first level in Rise, for example, is the Prophet's Tomb in Syria. But it's a bold statement when framed in conjunction with the aforementioned points. It says that Shadow is about tomb raiding at its heart. Where Rise and TR 2013 plugged all these pick-and-mix mechanic selections, combat, tombs, climbing, crafting, survival elements, into sandbox-like areas, Shadow anchors them instead with exploration in mind, and within much more complex landscapes. Naturally then, outfit crafting is the result of discovery. Combat is about finding a way to become one with the environment, and climbing is as much about learning a space as it is to reach your goal or to find hidden locations. As a result, Shadow of the Tomb Raider has a stronger sense of identity, mechanically. But what of new additions? The latest installment adds much more to the series as a whole, through a wider variety of accessibility options, new fundamentals, and more. Considering feedback and the series' mission statement, to please returning fans looking for a challenge and new players alike, Shadow completely reset the idea of difficulty to accommodate this. Rather than select easy, normal, or hard for the entire game, you're able to tailor 3 core aspects of play in this way: combat, puzzles, and climbing. Turn the climbing difficulty up to hard, for example, and you won't see white paint indicating the way forward, or in the case of puzzles, characters won't aid you with hints. They work well in conjunction with in-game skills too. For example, survival instincts can reveal enemies for tracking, which is very useful in a sea of trees, but if the combat is on hard, they won't appear at all. Cue the hilarity of mistaking a barrel for a soldier. Of course, you can still broadly apply a difficulty setting should you want. Turn the game up to Deadly Obsession difficulty, for example, and autosaves will be removed, as will regenerating health, survival instincts, which vaguely resembles Rise's popular endurance mode. It's the kind of setting that makes those unfriendly tombs look like Death himself, asking you to join him in a game of chess. No thank you. Or yes please, depending on your innate sense of courage, and that's why this edition works. Shadow of the Tomb Raider doesn't simply throw in some DLC, though DLC is coming, or extra activities for you to try, if you can be bothered. It lets you tailor the experience in terms of the fundamental gameplay pillars. Another stark new addition involves Lara's movement. Now, generally speaking here, her movesets haven't changed much, save for the overhang climbing ability and underwater segments involving swimming, grappling eels, and stealthing around fish, because, well, I'm sure there's internal logic there somewhere. However, her movement animation has had an overhaul to startling effect in the realm of game feel. In a series or timeline that stripped the deliberate precision from jumping and climbing a la the founding titles, adding a more laboured style of animation may not transform the act of climbing itself, but adds a completely different feel to movement. Where Lara used to bounce about like a spring lamb, in Shadow she has heft. She jumps with all her might, grapples and swings with effort, and lugs her body up and over at impossible angles. Sure, these impossible feats are unrealistic, but the change in animation adds a practicality to these. My own arms hurt just watching her, and I do yoga every day. Then we have skills and progression in the game, which classes as both new and not, mainly new. It is also vastly improved. I mentioned in my Survivor Timeline video that the previous two games recycled the progression system from TR 2013 in Rise almost beat for beat narratively, to a point where it felt quite strange. Starting out with nothing in TR 2013 made sense as a relative novice post-shipwreck. Lara had to craft the basics before upgrading as she learned new skills. The bow and arrow, for instance, allowed for fire arrows and then rope arrows. The pickaxe needed to be reinforced, you get the idea. Rise followed much the same formula. Though you were kitted out from moment one, the game swiftly reduced you to 0, post-avalanche this time, before moving you forward to craft the basics in much the same order. The skill progression system following the same pattern as Lara relearns what she already learned but forgot, I guess? Though the game did go on to add poison arrows and a wider variety of guns for combat. Shadow does something similar here in terms of building your arsenal yet again, to keep the gear-gated hub areas intact, I presume. However, it feels much less out of place for me, for a few reasons. For starters, she's overcome her skill amnesia. Almost all the central features from the previous installments, rope arrows, fire arrows, the pickaxe, are included as default. Not exactly from the beginning of the story, much like the other games. Only here, you're initially separated from your equipment, and find all of the exploration-related standards within the first jungle area. That said, and though the same can't be said for plot-essential weapons like the shotgun, you don't really learn and craft things from scratch, but do continue to build upon them over time, with upgrades and an expansion of base skills. Now the skill tree has been overhauled, adding all manner of elements to the fray that you can spend with experience points or act as a reward for completing challenge tombs, some of these only available in DLC content. Now where increasing the chance of looting an arrow from an enemy body returns, as do survival instinct highlights that transform you into an extra sensory killer, new abilities are abound, such as breathing underwater for longer periods, using fewer resources to craft special outfits plundered from crypts, and more. This kind of expansion applies to core skills as well. Because combat has shifted the focus away from heavy gunplay and towards stealth sections, opting to try and balance the two, brand new additions have been added in this area of play. The ability to camouflage with mud, for instance, allows you to go all Dutch and blend in with the jungle to be the ultimate predator. It frankly revitalizes the stealth elements that were roundly enjoyed in TR 2013, but were sadly only relegated to 1 or 2 open areas. If sneaking about the bushes and walls of foliage isn't fun enough for you, you can also hide high up in the trees and attack from above, stringing up enemies. A new and exhilarating use of both your trusty pickaxe and rope. You don't just have the option to lure enemies with poison arrows here either, but with the help of an ancient recipe uncovered in, you guessed it, another tomb, you can stick people with hallucinogenic arrows as well. Just for fun or to thin the herd further. You can even rig dead bodies with incendiary bombs. If plain old grenades aren't enough for you. And there's so much more I haven't mentioned. That said, Shadow takes the default weapons and mechanics that have become series staples and dared to build upon these. Not just with additional skills at the camp, but brand new mechanics by way of reward, story beat, and character customization. It once again creates a clearer identity. You are one with the jungle, whether it be raiding tombs without dying, charting the wild, or mastering your environment to survive. Shadow successfully develops the series rather than simply rinse and repeat what we've seen before. What of Lara, though? The central character around which all these elements revolve. I've made no secret about my feelings and how lacking I felt the previous two games were in the story department. This seems to be the area in which the Survivor timeline struggles most of all. Now, whether it was a cast of bland supporting characters and the crew of the Endurance, a patchy character arc in Lara in the absence of any clear, mappable character motivation, or an overstuffed, trope-ridden plot in Rise, both Tomb Raider 2013 and Rise of the Tomb Raider failed, in my view, to assert this new direction it so passionately advertised. Admittedly, there were a few moments in Shadow of the Tomb Raider that gave me mild whiplash with Lara's emotional pinging. However, and this is an enormous however, what Shadow attempts to do, and succeeds in doing, is use the story's mythological elements to represent Lara's character journey. In previous games, the mystical thingamabob, the silver box of Ixchel in this case, felt like a dangling carrot luring Lara to the next point or tomb. Emotional stakes were attempted, but ultimately it served as the reason to draw Lara from point A to point B, all the way to point D, where she would obviously save the world. I mean, what else is there to do? Locations created more narrative impact than the story itself, or characters. The radio tower, for instance, is a much more memorable moment when compared to the death of a major character in the same game. Contrastingly, Shadow is about theme. Mirrors, both mythological and visual, the sun and moon in Ixchel and Shakshel. Shadows and light, which are everywhere, from the title to game puzzles and literal lighting effects. The final ritual itself all emphasize themes of duality in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Lara's path to understanding and embracing everything about herself hinges on exploring that duality and conflict. Even the ending theme of the game, Goodbye Paititi, talks about a spiritual journey and how one always has the ability to make a choice, which leads to another prominent theme of Shadow, that of destiny. This isn't only apparent in Lara's mistake that, brings about the apocalypse and thousands of completely avoidable deaths, but represented too by most of the supporting characters. Jonah, Unuratu, and Dominguez all have their own views on what it means to choose and why one should choose at all. These characters all teach Lara something important. But the lesson doesn't end there. Side quests do very much the same thing in giving Lara the chance to learn more about herself, others, and ultimately who she is and must be. Sure, you could make the case that the plot is trying to fit an awful lot into what amounts to several hours of runtime, but there are themes of more than just surviving through adversity to become victorious at work here. Not only that, but the levels, visuals, characters, even music tie into these very clearly established ideas. There is very little in the way of narrative fat in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now, speaking of, I hated the title for this game at first. I tend to dislike video game titles that make very little sense beyond a string of buzzy-sounding words, but in this case, I stand completely corrected. The shadow the title refers to is not just represented by Lara's darker or shadow self, which drives some of the most impactful story moments, but also in terms of the Mayan and Aztec mythology. Whereas a title like Rise of the Tomb Raider implies a re-emergence of the character from the ashes, we don't really feel that in the game itself. All in all, the story of Shadow has a clear direction, character motivation, stakes, urgency, a cast of well-defined characters, all the while attempting to explore themes surrounding our protagonist through every element of the game. Now, I know what you're thinking. I've just spent an awful long time talking about all the things that work in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Surely the other hiking boot must drop at some point? Well, yes and no. How's that for duality? There are a few characters, like military leader Rourke, and one of the main antagonists in the game, that suffer from poor characterization, or in Rourke's case, an introduction simply relegated to a codex entry. Abby also wound up feeling more like a spare part, moved around the map where convenient, never mind if it made sense. I simply couldn't shake the feeling she primarily served as a potential romance option for Jonah to quash any ideas of a romantic relationship between he and Lara. Though both actors' performances were strong enough to handle this in my view.
You and Lara...
Friends, colleagues. She's brilliant.
So, you're not...
Oh, no. Nothing like that.
You'll also notice I haven't touched upon the visuals either. There is a huge difference between the visual style we saw in Rise of the Tomb Raider, which I preferred personally, and what we see in Shadow. Some took this to be a downgrade. I couldn't disagree more. Animals, foliage, insects and mud pools are packed so tightly into every square inch of Shadow's deeply, not to mention perfectly rendered world. Even I can see the visual upgrade a mile away, and I'm nearsighted. What we see in Shadow, though, is much heavier, much darker, and closer to TR 2013 in style, like a hefty oil painting. The visuals themselves are still spectacularly impressive. The settings and designs still jaw-dropping, and it suits the darker tone of the game. In one underground level, for example, in the distance, sliced out from the darkness of the surrounding caves, hangs a body within a stone archway. You gradually make your way to this body and further up the ruins to where even more treacherous silhouettes live. The Day of the Dead celebration is stunning as well, and boasts an excellent use of colour, burning like a candle amidst the dark. Still, for me, it wasn't quite as eye-wateringly pretty as Rise, though the visual upgrades are both clear and extraordinary. Now, my personal tastes aside, which have been known to be a bit peculiar, the visuals also pave the way for Lara Croft's redesign. Another improvement. Her muscles are much more defined this time around, and her default outfit, an athletic-looking tank top reminiscent of Croft's iconic clothing, create a much more formidable silhouette. Her face is a lot more authentically emotive this time around too. We have the chance to really see Luddington bring something of herself and of Lara's personality to the face in particular. Now, where the character in earlier entries in this timeline lacked personality, this improvement creates a real person from the mass of polygons and texture maps. It only adds to the care and attention paid to her role within the narrative. There is very little in this game that doesn't convince me Shadow of the Tomb Raider isn't the best example of what the series is aimed to do from the start, and for all the reasons I stated above. This game improves the foundational structure of the gameplay and story, expands and improves them in every way, which, if you saw my Survivor Timeline video, I was hoping would indeed happen. Wish granted. To a degree, it's also frustrating, as Shadow spends the course of the game righting so many wrongs that it doesn't necessarily transcend beyond being a fixer-upper. Even so, it creates a much more solid base, from which even better things can arise. Of the Tomb Raider. Only this is the third and I presume final game in the series. Disappointing. I would have loved to have seen more from this new Lara. More dangerous locations to spend hours adventuring in, deadly tombs to excavate, and supernatural myths to discover. What I find a little disquieting is how in some circles Shadow of the Tomb Raider seems to have caught the criticism for elements introduced and perpetuated in the games that preceded it, most of which simply aren't relevant here, and if they are, the same could be said for Tomb Raider 2013, Rise of the Tomb Raider, or both. Eidos Montreal have proven themselves time and again to be pros in the realm of sandbox, role-playing, action-adventure games, in building layered, imaginative worlds to unravel. Skills they have brought to the Tomb Raider table, and to the game's benefit. What I will say is that if the Survivor timeline hasn't impressed so far, it likely won't here. But I was more than pleasantly surprised by this game. If only this was where the Survivor timeline began. Hello and thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. I do try to read and respond to as many comments as I can. Now, this video would not have been made possible without the people that you see on screen right now, and I want to say a huge thank you to you for your support and for your generosity. I also want to say a very special thank you to Brandon Smith, Bryson Brody, Christopher Cotton, aka Shiny Silvery, Day Yang, Jacob White, fellow 2009 circa Starbucks mug owner Jessica Costello, my dad, very generous Michael Rivera, and That's Lemons. I see you. Again, thank you so much for your generosity and your support. You are keeping me and Critique Quest afloat. alive, which I suppose leads me to my next announcement, in that I have created a Patreon page. It's kind of backwards. If you would like to support me there, please follow the link in the description or the one that's on screen right now. Thank you again, and I will see you all in my next video, which will be at the end of the month. Goodbye for now.